Atlantic, but it does have members from across lots of different countries. And the idea is that we will give unbiased, non-political advice to independent commissions and to governments regarding the current state of the science and how that informs or could inform marine policy and management. So ICES is called on sometimes to give advice on a specific topic, but they also have a series of working groups that work on particular challenges. So it might be fisheries, it might be aquaculture, they cover pollution, they cover mining, so they cover all sorts of economic activities in the seas. And they cover, basically providing really up-to-date advice on the sorts of challenges, the questions and things that policymakers need to consider. So when we started conversations about this paper, we were working as part of the working group on historic fish and fisheries. So ICES groups meet usually once a year. There's an ICES annual conference that you might have heard of, and there'll be sort of specialist group meetings in between. So we meet and we talk about what we've been doing, current issues, challenges, and so on. So the Working Group on Historic Fish and Fisheries objective is to operationalise historical data for current science and management needs. So it's been around for about 10 years. And it really began to focus on recovering and digitising older data sets, because there was an appreciation that we were losing value, losing information on historical practices and historical behaviour. But since then it's evolved, and it's now become a bit more focused on us seeing what we can understand about marine social ecological systems through time. And of course, social ecological systems is how we're now all starting to think about management, because we appreciate that you can't manage the resource in isolation, you're actually managing the people accessing the resource. And the idea is that we provide concrete deliverables, such as this manuscript. So there's been a number of others. We also look at sort of opinion pieces, but for us, it's really about raising the profile of history, showing what we can learn from history that can inform present day practice. So that's who we are. And of course, one of the questions that comes up regularly for us is, why does history matter, or does history matter at all? And in fact, we are working on an opinion piece about this right now, because it's such a common question. Of course, from our perspective, history really does matter, because we've been interacting with ecosystems for centuries or thousands of years, in fact. And so, we have had an impact on systems, and we can look to the past to try and understand natural system dynamics, and to look at, socio-ecological feedbacks between us and the ecosystem. So here's just a quick example of sort of some of the evidence from history. So this is work by Lauren McClenahan, a paper in conservation biology back in 2009. And she looked at the size of large trophy fish being landed in the Florida Keys through time. So there are images, historic images of landings back in the 1950s. You can see lots of large fish, lots of predatory fish and groupers. By the 1960s and 70s, you've got the catches again. As you can see, there's still some large fish, but generally they tend to be smaller, and they're different species of fish. And then by 2007, you've really got far smaller fish. You've got a lot of snapper and things. You're not getting the groupers, which provides evidence that there's been a change in composition, but also a change in the maximum size of fish, for example. And the stats are something like the mean length of trophy fish declined by half, and their weight by up to 10-fold. So by looking at this sort of historic information, we can see how the assemblage in the Florida Keys of those sorts of predatory, those fast-swimming pelagic fish, have changed a lot in the last 57 years. And actually, whilst we know these things, we don't use a lot of historic data in terms of our management of the oceans, which is why we're really passionate about, getting historic information into current thinking and current practice. So that's just a bit about history. So our team, currently this working group is led by Ruth and Emily. And for the paper, there is about 30 of us from across 11 different countries, and we all have experience in fisheries and aquaculture. We are a complete mixture. I sometimes think a bit of a rebellious band of historians, historical ecologists, so people that look at the ecology of past systems, more contemporary ecologists, there's some social scientists, and as I said, I am the token paleontologist as well. So we started talking a few years ago, actually my first working group meeting, about what we might like to think about in terms of history, and everyone was talking about blue growth and whether examples of blue growth from history that we might learn from. So that's where we went with this paper. So we set out with the objective of, okay, the other examples of blue growth in history, and can they tell us anything useful? So as I said, this paper was published still in early view actually, back in May, in Fish and Fisheries. There's a link to it there, but also, you know, you can email me directly if you want a copy. So as you can see, there's lots of different authors from lots of different places. And we were able to do this because we used a case study approach. So we were able to gather information, historic examples from across countries and across slightly different sectors. So, blue growth. So, as I said, it's become a bit of a buzzword. It really arose out of discussions about the green economy and green growth back at the Rio +20 meeting in 2012. So that's a United Nations meeting. And they were promoting the idea of green growth as being something that could be sustainable and could be equitable. So the benefits could be equitable for a broader range of people. And this was in contrast to the idea of brown growth. So they sort of referred to heavily industrial growth, uses a lot of energy, not sustainable, not equitable, as being brown growth. You know, the idea that so far most of our industrial growth has been brown. So blue growth is really the equivalent of green growth, or the blue economy is really equivalent of the green economy. So the only real difference is its focus is on the oceans. So what the EU says about blue growth is that it's an initiative to harness the untapped potential of Europe's oceans, seas and coasts for jobs and growth. And that its objectives are to promote smart, sustainable and inclusive growth and employment opportunities within Europe's maritime economy. So we all know, I'm sure all of you know, how valuable the oceans are and how many jobs they provide. It's something like 31 million jobs that the oceans support, plus another 200 million people supported in terms of their livelihoods, directly or indirectly. You know, and there's been all sorts of economic quantification of the value of the oceans as well, in terms of ecosystem services. So the EU wanted to grow its blue economy and wants to see opportunities for that. And they focused on 5 main areas when they initially proposed this. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but up here on the left, so they focused on the extraction of mineral resources, renewable energies, biotechnology, coastal maritime tourism, and aquaculture. And at the time they initially proposed this, they did not include fisheries because, as you'll be aware, many fisheries within Europe and elsewhere are at or overexploited. They did subsequently take a slight step back and came to appreciate that, okay, maybe there was potential for growth in fisheries as well, by sort of improving practice, really. So that's what the European Union considers blue growth to be. And it has written an agenda and a strategy, well, an agenda for trying to achieve this. There's also been talk about blue growth from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And their blue growth agenda is a little bit different. And it aims to maximise economic and social benefits whilst minimising environmental degradation from these sectors. So it contrasts on the left there, sort of business as usual scenario where you might maximise profit, you might maximise sustainability, or you might maximise equity, but you wouldn't be able to do all those things, or we don't do all of those things at the same time. Whereas blue growth seeks to do all of those things, hopefully at the same time, which is a tall order. The other thing about the Food and Agriculture Organization agenda is that it's got more of a focus on developing countries and trying to grow those economies, particularly as they provide an awful lot of global seafood, like 80% or something. So it was taking a sort of a more regional approach as well, is how could it help to develop economies in particular regions. So there's some differences between the agendas, but ultimately they're both seeking to achieve the same thing, which is equitable and sustainable growth of ocean economies. So the thing about all of these agendas are that they sort of imply that blue growth is new. You know, it's a new term. It's trying to achieve something new, something that we haven't done before, which of course is why we started to think about it, because we started to think, is that really the case? You know, is it really true that, you know, there hasn't been economic growth in the past because of exploitation of ocean resources? Which is why we decided to look at it. So, you know, this is, particularly with the FAO, you know, they're contrasting it with business as usual. Business as usual is it's never been sustainable, it's never been equitable. But as historians working in fisheries and aquaculture, we actually know that we thought this was very unlikely to be the case, which was what prompted us to do this work. So we asked ourselves, is there value for blue growth from history? Does the past hold examples of what we would recognise as blue growth today? Did that blue growth, if we could find it, succeed or fail over time? And what were the drivers behind whether or not it succeeded or it failed? And we also asked, were there trade-offs? And if so, what were they? So here's a fish market at Lowestoft. I actually don't know what fish they are, but no shortage of them. So we focused on fisheries and aquaculture because we knew there would be historical precedents, unlike some of those newer industries like mineral extraction. I mean, we did find some examples of sort of aggregates and things, but it wasn't really enough to make a coherent story in the same way that there was when we looked at past fisheries and aquaculture examples. And, you know, these industries have been revolutionized hugely in the past. The development of salting or changes in transport, introduction of different gears, you know, the beam trawl, for instance, have completely changed the nature of these sectors in the past. So we were fairly confident that there would be examples of attempts at blue growth that we could look to. So what did we do? So the first thing we did is we looked at the Food and Agriculture Organization and United European Union, agendas, and we looked at how they were defining blue growth. And across both of them, there were 4 key things. The first one was that growth was achieved, there was economic growth. The second was that you could achieve balance between within your social ecological system, so you could achieve a balance with your ecosystem. And that balance could be maintained, so you could continue to exploit. Third definition was that there would be smart solutions implemented, so there would be some form of innovation. And the fourth was that you could achieve integration across regions and stakeholders, so you could successfully share access to a resource between individual stakeholders. So we looked for case studies that met 2 or more of these criteria so that we could consider them to be case studies illustrated blue growth for some period of time. So we looked for these case studies by talking to marine historical ecologists, primarily from our working group, and environmental historians that look at past environments. And as I said, we really focused on fisheries and aquaculture because we knew there were historical precedents there that we could look at. It's worth saying, actually, I've forgotten to say, but you know, the blue growth agenda so far haven't really looked at successes and failures in terms of informing themselves. And if they haven't really looked back more than sort of 5 to 10 years. And as I said at the beginning, that's also true in many cases of fisheries management, is we're not really using that long history of exploitation, that long history of human interaction with the environment that we have, which is one of the reasons that this is so important. So we used an expert opinion approach. So we had experts from the different fisheries of different countries, different time periods. And we identified 20 examples in fisheries and aquaculture of what we considered to be blue growth. Our idea was not to be exhaustive. We're not claiming we've looked at every possible example, but what we wanted to do is get a really good range of different countries, different durations, different stocks, different stories that we could learn from. And so we ended up with 20 case studies from across 13 countries, and you can see them all on the map here. Green are the aquaculture examples, dark blue are the capture fisheries, and light blue are the, dark blue are the single species fisheries, and light blue are the mixed capture fisheries. And here's our timeline. So we got a pretty good breadth. The case studies are anything from 40 years long to 800 years long, the oldest of which is the Venice Lagoon. You can see number 18 there. Other really long ones were reef fisheries in Hawaii. And yeah, there was a whole range of different examples, and some of them we looked at. So some of them I'm going to talk to you about in a bit more detail. There we go. So we took these 20 historical case studies and we looked for what were the outcomes in each case. So what happened in that fishery through time, and what might the drivers of those changes be? So for example, collapse of a stock. There might be evidence, okay, species were getting smaller, there were less fisheries landings, or maybe there was a change of gear, you know, it could be there was a change in legislation, it could be there was a change in some external factor, so external markets. We went through every case study and we looked at what we thought the main outcomes were and what the drivers of those changes could be. From that, we then determined what we thought the case study specific lessons were. So what could we learn from these events about blue growth individually? Then we looked across the 95 case study specific lessons for common lessons that occurred in more than 4 of our case studies. And we called these cross-cutting lessons. And we identified 14 of those. So the first example I want to talk to you about is from the Venice Lagoon. This is probably one of our favourites because it's got such a long and interesting history, and this is quite a complicated figure, so I apologise. But we wanted really to encapsulate the entire case study in one figure if we could. So you can see you've got a timeline in the middle there, with this fishery going back to about 1200. And then you've got a sort of interpretive bar in the middle there where we think things were sustainable and we know things were less sustainable. You've got landings up here of fisheries from the Venice Lagoon and the Manila clam. You've got the different gears that they use, different nets, different boats along the bottom, and then we've got a series of events. So sometimes these are political, so French occupation, Austrian governance. Sometimes these are about legislation being introduced and regulatory activities. And then we've got a series of outcomes. So what happened in that fishery and what we think the drivers of those changes might have been. So this is all from historical documentation. So if we look at the period at the beginning where we think practice was relatively sustainable, we can see that in terms of what we're going to call outcomes, there was good stakeholder engagement in the fishery. Market access was equitable. There was ecosystem-based management because they were managing across all of the fishermen and all of the markets. And environmental quality seems to have been preserved. Now, one of the reasons that this is probably the case in the Venice Lagoon is there was a real heavy dependence of the local populace on those resources. So the Venice Lagoon is a relatively large area of land in Venice, and it would have had multiple different populations accessing it. But being quite restricted, it was very susceptible to overfishing. There were these really sophisticated co-management practices through these things called fragli, where they had stakeholders involved in the management process. And the markets were really strictly regulated, both in terms of the gear you could use, the size of fish you could sell, and the price you could sell them for. And then there were experts that monitored the different species. So it was a really sophisticated system. And there were multiple lessons that we were able to learn from that, for instance, that we could take from that. So that stakeholders have a whole range of diverse perspectives and knowledge, and you can use that to support blue growth. Also, that management based on knowledge and monitoring is really important for achieving blue growth. And that to maintain blue growth, management and policy actually needs to be responsive, flexible and able to adapt, but also to take a whole system view. So these are the things we took from the periods of success in the Venice Lagoon. And as with all case studies, actually, it's very rare to find an example where it was always successful all of the time. But for the Venice Lagoon, you know, this was successful for hundreds of years. In the latter period, when things became less sustainable, shall we say, management wasn't appropriate and there was a lot of illegal fishing and destructive practices. And the drivers with that were for that, probably all this political upheaval. There were constant changes in terms of the governance and occupation by different countries. There was widespread poverty, so more people needed food, and so they deregulated fisheries. It became open access, but then it was no longer managed. The fishermen's corporations were abolished, and there wasn't any support for monitoring. And that demonstrates to us that, having supposedly equitable access doesn't make it open, and it doesn't produce the same outcomes. And that if you prioritize short-term gains, you're going to lose out longer term. And if you consider blue growth to be needing to be sustainable, then you need to think longer term. So that was the Venice Lagoon is a really interesting example. All the paper contains a supplementary material which has text and tabulated summaries of all of the outcomes and drivers. And this one we did turn into a figure as well, but all the source references and things are there. So the second example is the culture of Nori, which is an edible seaweed. In fact, it's the most valuable seaweed in the world that was cultured in Japan. And it's been cultured for, again, hundreds of years. But in this case, we're just going to have a quick look at what happened more recently. So after the Second World War ended in 1945, there was increased demand for Nori. So you can see the production of Nori at the top there. There was technological innovation that was subsidized by the government. So there was a lot of research into Nori that was happening at that time. And they made some really important discoveries. So they cultured it by traditional practices for hundreds of years. But it was only when they got into the 50s that they realized that Nori was one of those seaweeds that has an alternate life history. So it has a big macro stage and a little small stage. And they didn't even know, they thought they were different species. So that discovery gave them a lot more power in terms of being able to culture the seaweed. So they would culture it, obviously, in the sea itself. The infrastructure was developed and the government supported that. There were drying houses and seed production units that could be accessed by farmers. They're mostly family farming units. And because there was more nutrient inputs, because there was more people, some more sewage, more nutrients, meant more seaweed grew more successfully. So the yields increased 2 to 4-fold as a result of these changes. And it became more efficient and more reliable. They developed, freezers existed. So they actually found they could freeze the sporophyte stage and then plant their crop out, but they could keep some frozen. And if the crop failed, they could substitute and put another one out. They also started growing it further offshore because they were floating it, and things just became more efficient. Productivity soared. And access was relatively equitable because of these government schemes. And it was sustainable. After 1990, population growth in Japan slowed down and the process became more mechanized. It was more done by machines, so there were less jobs. There was also less national demand, and this is thought to have been like a fashion thing, that it just wasn't as desirable anymore to eat porphyra. So production was produced by fewer larger companies. As I said, it was more mechanized. There was some more competition from overseas, and there were fewer jobs for growers. But also the younger people didn't really want to work as farmers. Then more of them were going to work in the cities. So the Nori example is also really interesting. And it shows that the globalization of labour markets can mean that you need to assess equity across different scales. Equitable for whom and in what area. There may be social limits to growth. It may be that something is not a product that's attractive anymore. There was high demand after the war for nutritional purposes. Later on, it just wasn't as trendy, if you like, to eat seaweed. But political support can be really important in driving socioeconomic change, and it can have major impacts on existing production. In the case of Nori, it did. The infrastructure they provided allowed production to really soar. And it's worth saying that in Japan, actually, the perception is that they were always very innovative since the Ming Dynasty at trying to develop new approaches. And there are some historic examples of how growing techniques advanced even before these more recent ones. Blue growth can occur alongside activities, or does occur alongside activities in other sectors, and the impacts may be negative or positive. So external factors can be really important. In the case of Japan, they still culture Nori, but they now culture it in Korea, where labour is cheaper, rather than culturing it around Japan. So there's still big business for it, and there's a lot produced in China as well, but it's changed a lot in that time. So Across our case studies, we also developed some trajectories of the sorts of patterns that blue growth could follow. And we developed 4 of these that we thought were exemplified by our case studies. The first of which is, I guess, obvious, which is unbalanced growth. So you've got time on the horizontal there and blue growth on the vertical. And you can see you've got growth sort of semi-exponentially until it reaches a point at which overexploitation occurs and growth declines. This is the sort of pattern exhibited in the mixed fisheries in the Venice Lagoon in the latter part. And the little arrows there indicate how the balance is or isn't achieved. So in this case, we can say that economic objectives were being prioritized over the ecosystem or over social equity. So about more than five of our case studies exhibited this pattern. The second trajectory we identified was that there would be delayed unbalanced growth. And so similar to the first one, there would be growth, but actually the curve would be pushed to the right a little bit because there might be some innovation, say a development of a new processing technique or a new storage technique that would actually just mask, if you like, your overexploitation. You wouldn't see that until later. And in this case, it was also about prioritizing economics over equity and ecology. Our third trajectory was that there could be a period of recovery. So you'd get this exponential growth at the beginning, you might then have overexploitation, and then some change later, maybe you stop fishing, would mean that your ecosystem could respond and your system might recover. And we've got a little inset there of A, because obviously whether you're looking at A or C depends on your temporal window. And in this case, the ecology would have to be being prioritized in order for some recovery to occur. The final trajectory was that you could achieve balanced growth, but it was not necessarily one pretty smooth curve because it would be punctuated by both negative and positive factors. There might be a political shift, a change in governance, which meant a change in management. There might be innovation, there might be a new way to fish and to fish more, increase its production. There might be some other conflict, a new market might open up, there might be competition with other products. And in this case, we've suggested that it's more balanced where you've got some equity, some ecology and economics being considered in similar relative proportions. And this is the pattern we think exhibited by the Nori culture in Japan. So obviously we had a lot of lessons and I don't have time to go through all of them. So I'm going to go through the main ones and the recommendations before I give you a summary. So in terms of the cautions, one of the most important things we decided was that actually scale is really critical. If you're going to say blue growth has occurred, you've actually got to give the constraints. Because as you saw from those trajectories, if you're only looking at a little narrow temporal window, you're not seeing the whole picture. And also growth in one area, it might be fine, but another area may not be able to grow because of that. We can't manage the seas in isolation because fish don't respect political boundaries and so on. So it was really important to think if you're going to say you're going to try and achieve it, or you're going to say whether or not it's been achieved, you do actually need to define those parameters. To be sustainable longer term, you need to prioritize, long-term benefits over short-term, which isn't usually what happens. Otherwise, it is just brown growth again. Really important to consider outside factors, historically, but also today, other markets, other political changes in other countries, innovation, it's not, you can't just look in the one system. And expectations that the benefits will be equal are probably not realistic. The lessons that we learned that can support blue growth are that flexible ecosystem-minded management is really important, both with bottom-up and top-down control. And a lot of these we know are quite obvious from the science. Current thinking supports these lessons. There's a real need for growth to be supported by consistent science and monitoring and ongoing monitoring to know whether or not things are changing. Social norms and community buy-in have been really important for the success of the historic examples. And again, stakeholder knowledge and the leveraging of stakeholder knowledge has also been really important. I guess one of the main things we decided as well is that trade-offs are probably inevitable. The attempts of blue growth to achieve both sustainability and economic benefits and equity are probably you know, they're very unlikely to be easy to achieve. And actually, you need to decide what your goals are, you know, and you won't necessarily be able to achieve everything at once. So we took our 95 case study specific lessons. We took our 14 cross-cutting lessons from that. From this, we came up with 10 recommendations for policymakers in terms of current day blue growth. And we split these up into sort of the planning, implementation and ratification stages. So in terms of planning, our first recommendation was that you should define the temporal and spatial scales across which you're measuring blue growth. The second was that you should identify and engage stakeholders in the decision-making process as soon as you can. The third was that you should align technological advancement and economic growth with other system attributes. So are your supporting systems in place for there to be technological advancement? Does that impact social and cultural values or undermine them? And the fourth one was be aware that not all blue criteria may be achievable simultaneously. So you need a plan for deciding the trade-offs and deciding what your priorities are. So we also looked at whether these recommendations were already covered in the agendas, and we only looked at the main agendas, so the European Union agenda and the Food and Agriculture Organization agenda. And what we found is that the only recommendation in terms of planning that was covered by them was that you should identify and engage stakeholders in the decision-making process. I mean, this is a really popular idea at the moment, so we assume that's why it was mentioned in those agendas. But it was curious they didn't consider other things such as the scale over which blue growth was occurring. So in terms of enacting management, our first recommendation was to focus on facilitating equitable access, but recognise the potential of actions to impact user groups in different ways and mitigate appropriately. To adopt a holistic view of the system based on the best available science, but include people in that. And to enact regulations that are enforceable, otherwise they're not going to work. And to enact management that can adapt to those changes. And of these, one of the agendas mentioned facilitating equitable access, but again, none of the others were considered. And our final recommendations were, after blue growth agendas have been ratified, was to ensure that short-term gains do not undermine longer-term growth, which is, I don't know, the big one for me that keeps coming up. You know, you can't necessarily do both. And our final recommendation was that you have to continue to monitor the system and you have to consider to monitor drivers. Otherwise, you won't be able to ensure that blue growth continues. So here's just a quick summary of those and which documents they were covered in. So as you can see, some of them were touched on. We've put somewhat. So they were touched on, but they didn't explicitly consider it. Stakeholders was mentioned in both agendas, and access was mentioned by the FAO only. And the FAO didn't mention several of the other recommendations at all. So they didn't think about scale, they didn't think about trade-offs, and they didn't think about monitoring. So that's sort of a summary of where we got to in terms of what we could learn from blue growth. So just to sum up quickly then, there are opportunities for blue growth in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. We know this also from recent publications. There's been a couple of papers that have suggested that, so by Costello et al, that have suggested that by being more efficient and changing practice a bit, even, you know, maximally exploited fisheries, or sorry, fisheries at exploitation, you can still actually gain from that, which is why the EU then changed its agenda slightly to include fisheries. So growth can occur in that instance, say via product development, added value, innovation, or even ecosystem restoration. But you do have to be careful that innovation isn't masking over-exploitation. As you saw from our second trajectory, you know, innovation can make it seem more productive for a while, but actually later on you discover that it wasn't at all. Opportunities need to be assessed within historical context. So what are the stresses in that particular area? What are the socio-ecological drivers? How are people likely to respond? What might the trade-offs be? And there is plenty of historical context for most regions. We just need to look for it. And that includes other cultural contexts, wider markets, other sectors, particularly these days when we're all accessing a related resource and we have overlapping ecosystem services. You know, the synergies between those things have become really complicated to manage and really difficult. But these can be considered at regional scale. So you can look at past fisheries in a particular area and what the behaviour was. So that's pretty much all we've got to say today. Ruth might chime in some discussion in a minute, but I guess our conclusion was that, you know, we can learn from history, and we should actually update our blue growth agendas and our plans so that we can avoid repeating past mistakes. And I guess the thing about these agendas is they're all still fairly new, so it's still sort of the implementation stage. So it's a really good timely, a really good time for us to be talking about what blue growth is and how we can learn from our histories of exploitation. So thank you very much for listening. I think that's all I've got to say. I just have to figure how to get out. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryony, for the wonderful talk. That was very interesting. If anyone's, so right now we're having Q&A sections right now, and if anyone's got a question, please do type your question in the Q&A box in the Zoom bar below on your screen. Oh, I got one from Neil Hutchinson. How much of the historic data was in the public sphere or provided freely by the Fisheries Department, etc.?
Do you want me to come in on that, Bryony?
Yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, so yeah, that was a good question. I think the answer is that it varied massively. So we had these case studies from all over the world, as you saw. So, and actually importantly to point out that some of the data came from, say, fisheries departments, but some of it also came from very much public-facing archives as well. So, for example, open access newspapers, various other popular media sources as well. So I think it varies by country. But for the most case, these were historians accessing it or historical ecologists. So most of it was largely open. It was more a case of we needed to get the in-country expertise so that they knew where to look.
Cool. I've got a question myself. So what do you think are some potential areas for blue growth in Europe given by this study's finding, or which other areas that would you stay clear of based on your study as well?
In Europe itself, yeah, that's, I mean, obviously that's a tricky one because there's a lot of finfish stocks at, being fished at or beyond MSY. My feeling from the UK is that areas for growth are really within a lot of the invertebrate fisheries, particularly some of the bivalves, but certainly within Northern Europe, we're seeing a lot of warming waters around the UK. We're getting a big increase in cephalopods, for example. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity for growth within a number of invertebrate fisheries, with the caveat that obviously with a lot of these emerging fisheries, we're not entirely sure in terms of their exploitation and how we can manage that. But I think certainly there's a lot of room, I would say, to diversify out into some of these invertebrate fisheries in particular. That's a UK example anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really tricky as well with climate change, because stocks are moving, and so there's potentially going to be stocks that we can access in the UK that we never would have before, because fish are moving, because things are warming. So and I think the EU is really interested in trying to figure out what those things will be as well. Part of the Horizon 2020 funding, which is their most recent round, was asking people to try and answer some of those questions in advance. I've got another question here from Chris Skillies. He says, are you able to provide some examples of how government is or has considered or integrated these case studies and study into policy? Do you have any practical examples? Unfortunately, not yet. We have been asked this question a few times. We've been speaking to some reporters who've been interested to know, and we hadn't thought about it a lot, but who've been interested to know whether any of it is getting picked up. And I guess with a paper only having come out in May, it's sort of things a bit slow. We have been trying to push the press coverage quite a bit. And we have been talking to, we did send it to the FAO, who said they were very interested and they would look at it. We haven't sent it to the EU yet. We have been thinking about what we should do and how we might get some attention. But no, nothing has been like officially picked up yet. I mean, there is some interesting stuff. I don't know, Ruth, if you want to say something about your snapper work in terms of Queensland, because you were working with some fisheries modelers, weren't you, on some of your historic data?
Yeah, so I think, certainly there's been opportunities to, for some of this to go into the management and for that historical information to inform the management goals. I think in terms of Chris's question about, in terms of the broader organisations who are, with the EU and the FAO, I think it's probably important for us to mention that yes, these are very much. Blue growth is an emerging concept. A lot of it's quite high level at the moment. So then those examples of, they've not really worked through a lot of the examples in more detail in terms of those high level policy documents. So we're hoping that this came at a good time where we can start to show how, the history can help. But yeah, I think probably some of the better ones that we'll see, and Chris knows this, is once many of these restoration initiatives take place, then that might give opportunities to show how these blue growth principles can be put into practice.
Yeah, I guess once regional policies are produced, it might be a bit more specific, so they'll be looking for specific historic examples, but we couldn't really find many regional policies, could we? I think we found a couple, but again, still really early days.
Oh, I've got another question here. Someone's asking, will Brexit impact blue growth for the UK? And what's your opinion about it?
God, yeah, probably. Undoubtedly. I'm still hoping it's not going to happen, personally. In denial. Yeah, I'm sure it will. I don't know how. I guess we'll have our own policy, but how are we even going to manage our resources once Brexit occurs? Because all of the common fisheries policy is through Europe. Those that would have us leave Europe, present this idea that if we leave Europe, suddenly we're going to have all the fishing rights to all of our waters and everything's going to change. But why would it? Those are international agreements. I don't know if you have anything on that, Ruth, but I mean...
So the answer is that certainly yes, but essentially there's been a number of policy documents that have come out about, the next, these 25-year plans and what's going to happen after Brexit. A lot of them were very aspirational, actually. They were highly aspirational, and there was some cause for, being quite positive about it. I would say that the most recent rounds, I'm not entirely up to date, but there's been quite a lot of watering down of various commitments, and this is before we've really got into the negotiation and things. So all of that is still on the table. I'm not overly optimistic, but yeah. So I think it certainly will impact. But of course, we also have the devolved administrations. So I think actually what we'll probably see is that there will be quite different management going forward from countries such as Scotland versus England. So it's going to be interesting to watch it play out. I probably prefer to be on the other side of the world whilst watching it play out, but the way it is.
Well, yeah. If there's no any other questions, and I think that's it. Thank you so much for the seminar today. It's very interesting, informative on blue growth and aquaculture and fisheries, and certainly fits within Centre's agenda. And yeah, there's no more questions, then that's it. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. You have a good afternoon too.